This is Duke University.
So Jim, thank you. It's really an honor to have you here.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Jessamyn Hatcher teaches fashion studies and the humanities in the Global Liberal Studies program at New York University. She's working on a book on the politics of fast fashion, and one of her interests is the least examined parts of the life cycle of clothing: wear, storage, discard practices, and informal economies. She's co-editor with Thuy Tu and Minh Ha Pham of an upcoming volume about fashion and globalization. She's organized major conferences on the Triangle Shirtwaist Workers' Fire, and is the founder of the Human Textile Wellness Initiative, an action research lab that documents people's relationship to their own clothing. Professor Hatcher is working on, right now, on another piece on the French haute couture fashion house of the Calais Soeurs, which I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of. Founded in 1895 in the Rue Talbot, Paris, by four sisters. Jessamyn recently discovered 34 dresses by these sisters in boxes wrapped in tissue paper at a house bequeathed to NYU by one of its wealthy owners, who also commissioned and wore these dresses. And she's writing a story of how these dresses came to be made, found, discovered, and the legal battles surrounding the whole enterprise. Jessamyn earned her PhD at Duke University, and I'm very honored to say that she and I together co-edited the volume No More Separate Spheres, a next wave American Studies reader that was published by Duke University Press. She blogs on the Human Textile Wellness blog, as well as at the AlabamaShannon.com blog. I worked with Jessamyn when she was a student here. I believe this is her first time back in an official capacity since she earned her PhD. And it's really thrilling to welcome her back and join me in welcoming Jessamyn Hatcher.
Well, Jim, it was so interesting to hear a story that I didn't know about Duke's relationship to this really important accord in your history relationship to making these things possible, and I'm very excited that I get to follow you. So as Cathy said, I was a graduate student here, and this is my first time being back since I defended my dissertation. And so, you know, it's always really exciting to get an invitation to come do a talk, but this one feels particularly moving to me. I spent many years in the classrooms, many years working in the sub-basement of the library, many years walking my dog along the River and eating at Bond's. Is Bond still here? Mm-hmm. This is good news that Bond's is still here. And I feel like my friendships in my intellectual community that I found here are still some of the ones that are most precious and sustaining for me, and Cathy is a huge part of it. So I wanted to take the opportunity to just say a couple things about my dear mentor. I was sitting at a dinner on Saturday night next to a woman I hadn't met before, and I asked what she did, because in New York what you talk about is like real estate and what somebody does for a living. And she said that she was a psychologist who studied happiness. Right? So you can imagine what the next question is to this woman, right? What's the key to happiness? And she said that it had to do with generosity towards others. And so I was thinking about that in relationship to coming to give this talk at Cathy's invitation, and about how some of Cathy's joy and curiosity feels very closely linked to her generosity, which is something that, since I became a graduate student here, and it's something that has been an important part of my everyday life and also my career. So that is a shout out to Cathy. I'm going to be talking today, and some of the things that I have to say in the beginning, Jim has talked about already. We'll be talking about a kind of different relationship to this question, which is via different people's consumption practices. But because I think it's worth repeating the facts about Rana Plaza, I'm still going to start where I was going to start. So in April 2013, the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh killed 1,033 workers, the deadliest accident in the history of the garment industry. Much of the story was terribly familiar. In the months leading up to Rana Plaza, a string of factory fires killed hundreds of other workers. Most of the dead were young women who make up 80% of the 3.5 million textile laborers in Bangladesh. Pay at these factories is poor. Minimum wage is just $37 a month. And in recent years, inflation has spiked, but wages have remained stagnant. An $18 billion industry, textile exports are the key economic engine for this poor country, and there's little will to make substantial changes on the part of many politicians in the Bangladeshi government, many of whom are heavily involved in the textile business. Despite poor pay, long hours, abuse from employers, no job security, physical danger, and an entrenched political climate hostile to organized labor, sewing was less arduous than alternative employment, such as farming or domestic labor. In the rubble of Rana Plaza and the ashes of the factory fires, there were clues that pointed to a less well-known story. The dramatic changes to the garment industry that had taken place over the last 3 decades, and that have arguably made textile workers' lives even more precarious. These clues came in the form of tags, purchase orders, design specifications, and half-made garments for Zara, H&M, and Mango, among others, the brand names of so-called fast fashion companies. Fast fashion is a shorthand for a particular business model called quick response, or QR in industry parlance. Adopted by a number of fashion apparel companies beginning in the 1980s, QR has dramatically changed the way fashion is made and distributed. Its hallmark is speeding inexpensive versions of the latest fashions to stores by greatly reducing the time it takes to design, source, produce, and deliver clothing. In 1970, it took on average 6 months for clothes peddled by big fashion retailers to go from a designer's sketch to a store rack. Now it can take as little as 2 weeks. In the process, fast fashion companies have significantly altered historic patterns of consumption. Average consumers in the US, for instance, buy 4 times as many clothes as they did in 1980. And at the same time, the average price of clothes has plummeted. QR companies also have a huge global retail presence. As the New York Times recently reported, Inditex, which is the parent company of Zara, now makes 840 million garments a year and has around 5,900 stores in 85 countries, though that number is always changing because Inditex in the recent years has opened more than a store a day. QR has been enormously lucrative for the corporations that have adopted it. Inditex made 2 billion euros in profits last year, and its founder recently edged out Warren Buffett as the world's 3rd richest man. At the same time, QR puts enormous pressure on the factories where fast fashion is manufactured. Large orders for large numbers of styles that must be delivered in compressed periods of time mean that workers have to produce more clothes in more varieties more and more quickly. If a factory doesn't deliver on time, it won't get the next order. As Richard Locke, a political scientist whose work is focused on Nike's corporate responsibility program, told a reporter, often the only way that factories can make the variety and quantity of goods that brands want at the price points they're willing to pay is to squeeze the workers. In the aftermath of Rana Plaza, fast fashion was front-page news. Reports peeled back the opacities of QR companies' supply chain. Editorials urged corporate, governmental, and activist pressure, collaboration, and change. At the same time, the logic of distance that typically separates consumers of clothes from the people who make them seemed to unravel, or at least defray. And so article and article also focused on the question, what can a consumer do? In response to this question, news organizations looked repeatedly to the authors of 2 timely books published before the collapse of Rana Plaza. Elizabeth Klein's 2012 Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion, and Lucy Siegel's 2011 To Die For, Is Fashion Wearing Out the World? Klein's book is marketed to US readers and Siegel's to a British audience, but both volumes aspire to, quote, do for t-shirts and leggings what Fast Food Nation did for burgers and fries, as Cathy N put it in her blurb of Klein's book. In the days following Rana Plaza, Klein, for instance, appeared on NBC Nightly News, and MSNBC was the subject of a New York Times Timescast and was quoted repeatedly in that paper. She was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and NPR, and Siegel reported from her post as the ethical living columnist at The Guardian and on the BBC television. Overdraft and To Die For share similar narrative arcs and deploy a similar narrative conceit. Each author positions herself as an every woman addicted to fast fashion who one day peers into her closet packed with fast fashion purchases, feels blasé about the clothes hanging there, and sets out to, quote, unravel the backstory of fast fashion. Each sets out to document the decline of local textile manufacturing, investigates the conditions in factories where fast fashion is produced, and recounts the story of how clothing donated to charitable organizations in wealthy northern countries flood secondary markets in the global south. So, what each author draws from her investigation is that her unsatisfying aesthetic choices are also bad ethical choices. So, as a result, each author decides to give up fast fashion. She puts herself on a diet of, quote, buying better and buying less, particularly by buying from small, local, ecologically conscious fashion brands, shopping for secondhand garb, and learning to make her old clothes. Each author presents her regimen as a way to simultaneously act on behalf of her own sartorial and psychological well-being, local economies, exploited workers, deluged secondary markets, and the environment. In each book, the author explicitly imagines her readers to be like herself. They are, quote, intelligent fashion consumers who have unconsciously drifted into becoming passive, herd-like consumers. So, I don't have to come around to your house and have a look to make a good guess at what you've got in your fat wardrobes and hard-to-shut drawers, writes Siegel. Each author explicitly offers herself and her book as a how-to guide for readers to follow, to, quote, help you forge a fashion future that matches your aesthetic to your ethics. Siegel. Sifting through this material, I was struck with a sense of urgency brought to the question about the responsibility of consumers and hopeful about the will to change that seemed to exist in the wake of Rana Plaza. But I was also struck by the conception of the fast fashion consumer that emerged in these accounts. The subject that Klein and Siegel have imagined is white, Western, native-born, educated, cosmopolitan, and female. She is privileged financially. This imagined consumer can afford to purchase clothes that are much more expensive than those sold at fast fashion outlets, even if she has been choosing not to. And she can afford to buy and store clothes that she doesn't actually need. She's also privileged socially. She identifies herself as a member of the public and professional sphere, and she understands that dressing fashionably is an important part of her participation in it. But she has lost her way, become disaffected, careless. Her fast fashion self is impoverished, even degraded. Her purchases and her person clothed in those purchases are without quality, ethics, agency, consciousness, and anything but the most fleeting and trivial experiences of pleasure. The clothes themselves are without beauty, craft, or meaning. They are, to quote Klein, homogeneous, generic, and crudely slapped together. But through education, sympathy, particularly sympathy for textile workers, and by shopping differently, the subject can change both herself and the world. I was especially alert to the representation of fast fashion consumers because for the last 2 years, I have been interviewing a group of young South Asian women about their avid use of fast fashion. These women, who are from Nepal, labor in a nail salon in downtown Manhattan in New York City's booming body service industry. These subjects differ greatly from the one presented in Klein and Siegel's framework. The women are working class. They labor in the service industry. They are non-white. They are undocumented immigrants. They make at best minimum wage. They have marginal disposable income. They spend a large portion of their wages on remittances to their families. They don't imagine they have the same relationship to Bangladeshi textile workers as do Klein and Siegel, and they aren't blasé about fast fashion. Certainly I didn't see anybody like the women with whom I was spending time at the nail salon in accounts of fast fashion consumption. I wondered, how does inserting these subjects into an analysis of fast fashion change it? Does a different story in front of fast fashion's label matter? At the very least, what I've been learning from the women about the role fast fashion plays in their lives calls for new kinds of attention to how fast fashion circulates globally and how people who occupy different subject positions make use of cheap, chic clothes. As QR retailers open at least one store a day somewhere in the world, and increasingly not in Western urban centers, fast fashion becomes a cultural and social form urgently in need of more examination. At the same time, Klein and Siegel, right, it's right that Rana Plaza horrifically demonstrated the need for a critique for fast fashion. So my question today is, how can we move forward with a critique of fast fashion that takes into account a diversity of use and users? In summer 2011, I began interviewing 8 Nepali women who work at a nail salon in downtown Manhattan about their fast fashion practices. The women are between the ages of 25 and 35 and have worked in the salon for an average of 5 years. The primary services at the salon are manicures and pedicures, and the salon also offers waxing. The women work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for which they are paid $6 an hour and whatever they garner in tips. Only one woman's ongoing immigration status is secure. This summer, one of the subjects I was interviewing was deported. The project didn't start off about being about fast fashion or about immigrant labor's use of it. At the time, I had begun a study about clothing storage and discard practices in New York City, and it was research for this project that brought me to the salon. Eventually, when I got to know the women better, we met outside of the workplace and exchanged messages over Facebook. My first conversations with the workers, though, took place during the salon during regular business hours, most often in the back room where clients received pedicures. The women gamely answered my questions about how they stored and discarded their clothing, but my attention was quickly drawn away from these inquiries to other more charged and urgent exchanges surrounding fashion taking place in the salon. I began, for instance, to register more closely the constant conversations about fashion between the clients and the workers that I overheard. These conversations were almost always initiated by the clients, and they were almost always struck up by the clients in a very particular way by complimenting workers' clothing. I began to notice the bags from H&M and Zara the workers routinely seemed to have with them. And I began to take in more fully the highly fashionable ensembles the workers wore to labor in the salon. Sunita in a perfectly cut V-neck t-shirt with an abstract black and white graphic over shiny copper leggings. Deepa sporting a loose, sheer Georgette blouse printed with flowers over a black camisole and skinny jeans. Nina in one of her bright, colorful, happy dresses, as she called them, that she favored with a special preference for royal blue. These outfits, I came to learn, were all assembled from fast fashion purchases. I was intrigued for 2 reasons. First, on the face of it, as I will explain, not much about the role of fast fashion in the nail salon makes intuitive sense in terms of economics or utility. And secondly, books like Klein's and Siegel's did not prepare us to picture fast fashion consumers to be working class, undocumented immigrant women dressing for their service industry jobs.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.